Welcome, everyone. As mentioned earlier in the chat pod, you will be able to find the webinar materials, including a PDF of today's slides, on the event page under Event Materials. It's the top of the hour, and I hope you're excited to jump in. My name is Kim Smith, and I am a program coordinator for OneOp. I will be moderating, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, Evidence-Based Interventions for Supporting Military Spouse Career Development. In case you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully, you are currently able to view the slides we're sharing. If you are unable to see them or have any other difficulties, please email us at contact@oneop.org for tech support. Throughout today's webinar, we will be inviting you to join us in the chat. To embed the chat pod so you don't miss any links or conversation, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You will then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen. From there, just click the chat bubble icon. When typing questions or comments, please be sure to select everyone from the response options drop-down menu so everyone is able to view them in the chat pod. Please feel free to type your questions throughout today's presentation in the chat pod. We will have a few minutes at the end of the presentation to answer questions. Please note that the slides and resources are available for download on the event page for today's session. We will be covering continuing education information at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned toward the end if you're interested in continuing education credits or a certificate of attendance. If you need to step away at any time, the webinar recording will be available on the event page within 48 hours. Finally, closed captioning is available for this webinar. The subtitles can be turned on using the Zoom toolbar. Thank you for joining us as we continue our partnership with the War Department and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of the professionals supporting our military service members and their families. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the Department of War, USDA, U.S. government, or OneOp. The mention of any entity or product is for informational purposes only. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Seth Hayden as our guest speaker today. Dr. Hayden is an associate professor of counseling and coordinator of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program at Wake Forest University. A licensed clinical mental health counselor in North Carolina, his work centers on supporting military service members, veterans, and their families. Dr. Hayden's scholarship focuses on the intersection of career development and mental health and integrated models of clinical supervision focusing on positive growth and counselors' ability to formulate interventions, and he has published extensively in this area. He is a past president of both the Military and Government Counseling Association and the National Career Development Association, divisions of the American Counseling Association. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Hayden, and I will now turn it over to you to begin our presentation.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Seth Hayden, and I'm really excited to be with you all today. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share some information with you, to talk about the experience of military spouses. Many thanks to OneOp and the supported organizations that Kim just discussed for providing this resource. I see in the chat that there's some people sharing a little bit about where they're from and who they are. And so I encourage you all to do that. So we certainly want to know where you're coming from, and excited for you to be here. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this important discussion. So I want to share a little bit of what you can expect in our time together today. So we do have some very specific objectives and what we're going to discuss. First, we're going to describe unique experiences and challenges related to the career development and employment of military spouses. So certainly a unique population with some unique experiences, and we will discuss that. We will also examine current research on career and work stressors faced by military spouses. So we going to talk about some of the evidence that indicates aspects of their experience. I'm also going to talk about a specific career development model, and going to go into that into some detail, and then also related interventions with the thought of empowering military spouses in achieving positive career development outcomes. And so that's going to be a big part of the discussion today. And then also going to provide resources and strategies to effectively support career development and work experience of military spouses. So that's what we're going to be covering today in various ways. And I'm looking forward to sharing some information with you. So as I've already indicated, if you have not, if you're just hopping on, please share a little bit about who you are, what you're doing, where you're from. Looks like we've got a little bit of a variety, some people from Arkansas and uh, also over in Germany and England and also some here in North Carolina. I'm in North Carolina. And as was indicated, I'm at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And I work as a professor in the Department of Counseling. I also have my license. So I'm also a practitioner, and I'll share a little bit more about my experience. But I want to give people a moment to share a little bit of who they are, where they're from, and then we'll move forward. At San Diego, a couple of people from there, Norfolk, New York, and looks like there's some different roles that people have, which I really appreciate the variety. And one of the things that people told me when I've been to various presentations is take what you need and leave the rest. So hopefully you're taking a lot. But as we're having our discussion, one of the things I would encourage you to do is to think about how this might apply to my work. And I probably don't have to tell you that, but would just encourage you to do that. How might this apply to the people that I serve? Because I think there's some utility in that perspective. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Again, feel free. We got a Wake Forest alum, at least the son of one of our participants who's a Wake Forest alum. Go Deeks. That's what we say around here. So go Deeks. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get into things. This is, again, providing career development support to military spouses. That's the focus of this discussion. And as Kim already talked about, I don't want to spend too much detail on this because I don't think it's the best use of our time, but I am a licensed counselor. I'm associate editor of a journal. So the National Career Development Association is a professional organization in a division of the American Counseling Association. They have a journal, and it's called the Career Development Quarterly. And so I'm an associate editor of that. And I focus a lot on the career development and mental health connection in and of itself, but then also how does that translate over to military associated populations? Because I think there's a lot of overlap. I do think that the military experience is unique, especially as it relates to career and work. And so a lot of my focus is on that. I still actively practice at times. There's a nonprofit here in town that provides support to veterans who are unhoused. And so they have 2 years of secured housing. And within that 2 year program, there's a lot of supports that are provided to them. And so I have provided personal and career support to that population. I actually did a career development group just not that long ago for that population. So they get 2 years of support, and I provide counseling services to them while also doing what I do here at Wake Forest. Okay, so there's some pictures on the slide for those of you who are unable to view it. And so the pictures are related to different elements of career and mental health. And I have a question mark on it. And so there's a picture of North Carolina. There's a picture of a piggy bank. There's a picture of a handicap parking spot. There's a picture of voting booths. There's a picture of artificial intelligence. There's a cap and gown picture around in terms of education. people wearing masks. So one of the things that's interesting to me that I focus a lot in my work is how is career and mental health related? And the question for me is not if, but how, because there is substantial evidence of there being a connection between career and mental health. And certainly when we think about the experience of those connected to the military, certainly that can manifest in various ways. Um, as we think about the pandemic, and that's one of the things that is just a fascinating human experience. Obviously, it was horrible in a lot of ways, but also brought to light, I think, how career and mental health are related. So we had people who were rapidly transitioning to new ways of working based on the pandemic, and it required people to adapt new skills or required people to significantly shift work. It required people who are in certain positions to transition significantly into others. Also brought up, I've found that people started maybe asking themselves some questions about the work they do, and do I want to continue to do it in this way? And so the pandemic, I think, was a unique experience, and that goes without saying, but especially related to career and mental health, because I think it brought forward a lot of things that were already there, but really amplified our understanding of how these things are related. I mean, I was teaching classes with my family in the other room, and that's not typically how I would do that. And so I had to manage that. And so there are a lot of unique elements of that. Certainly, artificial intelligence, I mean, I've heard someone say you can't have a presentation without talking about artificial intelligence. I think there's some merit to that. Certainly, that is related to career and mental health in terms of how people are adapting to this new reality, how it is they work, how it is their roles are enacted around artificial intelligence. I think certainly is something to keep in mind, and it impacts the worker, impacts corporations and places of work in various ways. Certainly people's mental health experiences. So when we think about this connection between career and mental health, it's a reciprocal relationship. It goes in both directions. So when people are having career experiences that can impact their mental health both in positive and in negative ways, and when people are having experiences around mental health, it can impact their career and work in both positive in negative ways. And so I think it's just, again, that's where I focus a lot of my work because it's just so fascinating to me when we think about that. And I think as a counselor, it's important that I have awareness of that, that I um, use information to inform that engagement so that I can provide support. Where you're located, so if you're in North Carolina, I think you have a different career and work experience than maybe if you were in Alaska, or if you're in Hawaii, or if you're in New Hampshire. And so, in terms of the availability of various jobs, in terms of the broader economic climate, those kinds of things, I think where you're located can impact that. I was talking with somebody who lives in Western North Carolina in Asheville, which, for those of you who don't know, Asheville is kind of a desired place for a lot of people to live. It's very beautiful. It's kind of in the mountains, and this person was saying that people don't ever want to leave. And so when they graduate college, they get their graduate degrees, whatever it is, that they always focus on jobs there in that area, which obviously is limited to certain kinds of jobs, big tourist industry in Asheville, but also doesn't have other jobs. And so it's an interesting consideration, I think, about where people are located. And then finally, on this slide, the broader political climate. There's very initiatives that governments enact around career in terms of increasing resources, increasing training in various occupations. And so I do think the broader political climate influences resources devoted to career and the various things that are supported and opportunities that are encouraged. So when we talk about military spouses specifically, there are some things that have been indicated around their concerns. And so if you are not already, I encourage you to pay attention to the Blue Star Military Family Lifestyle Survey results. So they do this every year, and it's something I pay attention to. So Blue Star Military Family Lifestyle Survey, they release the results. They'll have an executive summary, which is a brief summary, but then also a full report. And they essentially are looking at what is the experience of military families. And it's interesting to me because they'll talk about it in terms of active duty, but then also in terms of veterans, and then also the experience of active duty families and the experience of veteran families. And so in looking at that information, I think it helps us inform what should we maybe be exploring with those we serve. What are their needs? What are they indicating as important? And so as you see here on this slide, and I'll just highlight a couple of things for those who can't see it. Uh, Employment is frequently indicated as one of the most pressing concerns, especially within active duty spouses. So military spouse employment is 54% of the most pressing issue within military families. So that's a significant concern. And so we'll get into some of the unique experience of that population, but also something to think about. Within veteran spouses, military spouse employment isn't as highly rated, but is still one of the top concerns for veteran spouses. So there's a little bit of a difference between active duty and veterans, which I think makes sense for those of us who work with this population. Makes sense because the experience is different, but employment consistently is indicated as something that they're thinking about. And so I think that's important just to keep in mind. And so within our own work, how much of that are we paying attention to? How much of that are we looking at? And then how are we effectively supporting them with that? And of course, going back to the career and mental health, there's some overlap amongst these concerns. And so, but I also want to emphasize the fact that career and work is something of concern within military families and certainly for spouses. So when we think about kind of the challenges and transitions and the broader landscape of the experience of military spouses, unemployment rate for active duty spouses has been indicated at 20%, which is significantly higher than general population. And then we think about the economic reality for military families. It's been indicated that two incomes, so having two people who are engaged in employment outside of, not to say that working at home and supporting a family is not work, but in terms of active gainful employment from a financial standpoint, 77% of military families have indicated that two incomes is needed. And one of the things that happens, I think, when people reach out for support is that there's not always a sense that the people who are providing the services to them have a full awareness of their experience. That's one of the reasons why I focus on the needs of this population. I myself have not served, but when I was early in my training, I came to realize how little I knew about the military experience. And also realize that most of the people that you're going to encounter if you're within the military are people like me, are civilians. And so I wanted to ensure, to the degree that I'm able, that I at least have some requisite knowledge and awareness of their experience so that I can provide effective support. And so that seems to be showing up in terms of what um, military families are indicating is that there is not an understanding of the experience of military and veteran populations, the issues they encounter and the things that they're thinking about, like we just talked about. There's just a lack of awareness. And 37% within the veteran respondents and 36% for spouses of veterans. So pretty close in terms of them saying civilians just don't seem to get it. And then there's also this thought of transitioning from military to civilian life. There's some concern about that. And so veteran respondents and also spouses have indicated there's some concern about that transition from the military to civilian life, and certainly employment and work is a big aspect of that transition. And then 19% of active duty spouses believe that the public truly appreciates military family sacrifices. That's a pretty low percentage. So that would indicate 81% feel as if people don't truly appreciate it, which I think is important. And also military family sacrifice. It seems as if often we focus on, and understandably so, the experience of those who are serving, but don't always have the awareness of the impact of that experience on families, spouses, children, so on and so forth. And so again, seems to be that there is military families are indicating that people don't seem to fully understand the degree of sacrifice that that experience entails. So I do think as the title of this presentation is evidence-based practices. So I do think with that in mind, it's important to talk a little bit about some evidence. Now, I'm going to not go into too much detail. This is actually a study that I facilitated with others. And so I'm not going to get into too much of the weeds of research and statistics, but I do think it's useful to have awareness of what does data tell us about the experience of those military spouses who are having this experience. So I'm going to a couple things when we're doing a study, we have some questions that guide the study. So these were the questions that guided our work. And so we were really interested about military spouses, and they were transitioning from the military to civilian life. And again, something that was indicated in the previous slide that there's some concern around that. So we wanted to know more about that. And then what degree did military spouses perceive they had resources as they were making that transition from the military to civilian life? And then is there a relationship between their level of stress and the resources? And then are those resources, do they tell us how much stress they're going to have? That's what the predictive word is from a research standpoint. How much are those things related to each other? Okay, so this kind of guided our work. This is who was part of the study. We had 126 people. This is how it broke down in terms of these various elements. And so just I think it's important to have some sense of that, mostly female, um, and then also ethnic, racial elements as well, and then also their age. So this is who comprised it. And then we also wanted to know a little bit about where they were in that process of separating. And so most were pretty early on, so 0 to 5 months. And then the service status, most of them were active duty. And then branch affiliation, which many of you may have awareness of this, but if you're going to consider one's experience in the military, there's, I think, a level of importance around the branch in which they are serving, not only for the service member, but also for the military spouse, because it can greatly influence their experience. And so most of the people that were a part of the study were in the Army. But we had actually some variance there and representation from 5 of the branches. Okay, so we looked at stress with one assessment, we looked at their resources with another, and then we also just tried to get some of the information that I just shared with you all, looking at stress, resources, military spouses as they were making that transition. So what we found is that there seemed to be like some degree of stress for sure. So they did say that that transition that they were making was something that had some degree of stress. I don't It's pretty consistent with other studies around their degree of stress. So I don't think the group that we talked to like had a significant difference in terms of elevations of that. But it did seem like there was some degree of stress related to that. And then also um, their degree of resources. They seem to feel like they're fairly supported. The average was 80 and the highest score was 105. So they felt like they had some resources as they were making that transition. And so I think the benefit of this in terms of how it shows up in practice, like what are the implications of the information that we gathered, is that if you are someone who is working with military spouse who's transitioning and thinking about career, work, other things as well, maybe look at how are they feeling about it? Like what is their level of stress around that? What kind of resources do they perceive that they have access to? And then part of your work, and many of you may already do this, but part of your work would be to connect spouses with resources to potentially lessen some of that stress. I think to understand the military and also the military spouse culture. So again, they've indicated they don't sense that people have awareness, and you may have served in the military, you may not. But regardless, I think it's important that we have some understanding of that experience so we can contextualize their concern. I think we also need to reflect on our own kind of beliefs around the military experience and what that looks like, because I think that's just, as practitioners, having awareness of our own perspectives is always useful. And some questions you can specifically ask, because research seems to indicate there's some relation to that. What's the reason for the spousal transition? What is the reason for the separation? Maybe it's just the time's up. Maybe there's some other things that are contributing to that separation. So looking at that, how long has the military been affiliated with, or the spouse has been affiliated with the military, their level of education, prior work experience, maybe some relational quality discussion, kind of looking at that. Kind of how roles play out in the family. And so, certainly with deployments and stuff like that, this becomes a big consideration in terms of familial roles, and then how they see themselves in terms of their military identity, how much they align with it, if they have perspectives that vary from that, just some things to think about. So these are questions to explore with military spouses when you're working with them around career and work and really just kind of various transitions. So I'm going to share a little bit about the theory that I mentioned earlier in our objectives. So a perspective that I think have value when working with military spouses on career is cognitive information processing. And so I'm going to describe it. I'm going to go into some detail on this, and just also talk about how it applies specifically. So cognitive information processing career theory is cognitive behavioral in nature. So what does that mean? And so what that means in terms of cognitive behavioral is that we want to focus on beliefs. So there's three things that are, in my view, like critical components of the human experience: thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And I think those things are related to each other. And so with cognitive behavioral and with CIP, I'm going to use CIP as cognitive information processing theory. I'm going to say CIP just for the shorthand. We want to focus on those thoughts and beliefs because that drives feelings and behaviors. CIP also focuses on problem solving and decision making. And what I think is really of value in terms of this approach is that these are skills that can be taught. So when we think about how it is we support a military spouse in terms of their career and work, that we can help them develop career problem solving and decision making skills. And that's a focus of this approach. We also want to determine their level of readiness. So if I'm going to do something, this is not a one size fits all approach. I have to curtail the approach to the unique needs of those I serve. And it's not that there aren't like structures and very specific things, because there are, and I'm going to talk about those. But I don't give each person I work with the exact same thing. I need to adapt what I'm doing based on their needs. Another element of CIP is we want to expand knowledge of self options and their decision making. And we want to empower them to effectively engage in career problem solving and decision making. And I think this has unique relevance to military spouses because oftentimes they don't have as much volition as their civilian counterparts in terms of the work that they do, what options they have available to them, how it is they progress through their career. It can be significantly impacted by the military experience. And so CIP wants to empower people to make those decisions, whatever the contextual factors indicate. It looks like the chat is pretty active, which I appreciate that. Thank you all for that. And as it was indicated, we'll certainly respond to some of these things as we move along. Okay, so with CIP has several dimensions. And one of the analogies I've heard, which I think resonates with me, is there's like, it's kind of like a cooking recipe. And so when we prepare a meal and we have a specific recipe that we're preparing, there's ingredients, like I need to have these things to prepare the meal. But then there's also, how do I put those ingredients together? And so there's like the things I need, and then there's how do I, um, again, put those things together to complete the recipe. So from a CIP perspective, the pyramid of information processing are the ingredients of career problem solving and decision making. These are the ingredients. And I have here a practitioner version, and there's a reason why that's labeled as such. So with CIP, one of the things we do is we actually share this with the people that we serve. But we don't share the practitioner version because it's very technical. I'm going to walk through it. The next slide has a client version, and I'm going to describe that. But from a CIP with the ingredients of career problem solving and decision making, we have self-knowledge, which is the bottom of the pyramid, and that's values, interests, skills, their employment preferences. We also have options knowledge, like what are they aware of in terms of occupations, work, careers. And then we have the decision-making domain, which is the middle of the pyramid. How does one go about making decisions? And in parentheses, there's the Kasavi cycle. I'm going to talk about that more in a few slides, but that's the decision-making domain. Who do they talk to? What is their process? How do they go about making a decision? And then the top of the pyramid is metacognitions. And so that's those thoughts and beliefs that I talked about earlier. And so self-talk, self-awareness, how do they monitor and control various aspects of their behavior? So it's important from a CIP perspective that we think about all of these things when we're working with somebody. What is their self-knowledge? What is their options knowledge? How do they go about making decisions? And what are the thoughts and beliefs and feelings as well that they carry with them into this process, because these things are related. And these things are related. These different components are connected in various ways. So that's the practitioner version that I just described, but here's the client version. And so when I'm working with somebody from a CIP lens, if I'm working with a military spouse, I'm going to explore these things with them. I'm going to ask them about their interests, values, and skills, which is knowledge of self. I'm going to ask them about occupations that they've thought about and what is their awareness around that. I'm going to ask them about how do they go about making decisions. And if they're coming with a career decision, I'm going to ask them how have they navigated this thus far? What information have they collected? Who have they talked to? What is their process that they've enacted so far? And then what is their thinking about it, but then also their feelings around it. And so I let the client, if I'm working with a military spouse, I'm going to explain to that person, this is how we're going to do this. So I've got this pyramid here. It's got these different areas. We're going to explore it. And when someone tells me their story, if I have a military spouse who comes and talks to me and they start to tell me about what's going on, I fill in their pyramid based on what they're sharing. So if they tell me, I graduated with a degree in art history, I really love art. I think it's wonderful. I like to go to museums. I'm really interested in the history of it. So that's knowledge of self. So that's their interest. I might talk about their skills. Do you paint? Those kinds of things. They might also say, I don't really know what to do with my degree. I got this degree in art history. I don't really know what options are out there for me in relation to that. I've done some other kind of work, but I don't really feel like I'm utilizing my degree the way I want. And so that's their knowledge of options. And they may not have a lot of knowledge of it. And so the military spouse may continue by saying, I've talked to my spouse about this because I value their opinion. I also talk to my family because they're kind of my support network. I've also talked to friends. I've gotten on the internet and I've tried to gather information about things because information is important to me. And so that's how do I make decisions? They talk to people, they value input from their spouse and family. They value information. And then they might also say, I'm really anxious about being able to find something because I've done all these other kinds of jobs, but it's not directly related to what it is that I want to do. And I'm a little anxious about that. And I'm not confident and I don't really have a belief that I'm going to be able to find something. That's the top of the pyramid. And so a lot of that information comes from them just telling their story, and I fill in their pyramid according to that. And so while the pyramid is consistent, each person has their own pyramid. And what it is they tell me um, is useful, and we use that to populate this pyramid. And then there's the Kasabi cycle. So that's that decision-making domain is indicated in the pyramid. And there's the practitioner version. So we go back to the recipe analogy. This is how we put the ingredients together. And so we start with realizing there's something I'm trying to solve. So I've got something I'm trying to figure out. That's the communication phase. And then I do some analysis. So what is my understanding of myself, options? How do I make decisions? And what's my thinking around this decision-making process? That's the analysis phase. And then as I'm navigating the career concern and trying to figure out what the answer to it is, I've got to expand to potentially narrow options. So that's synthesis. Because what happens sometimes is people will have a narrow um, set of options as they're thinking about, and it might benefit from us actually expanding it for various reasons because they may have limited it for reasons that are not going to be useful for them. So we need to expand at times, but then we also need to narrow. Then we have the valuing phase where we want to prioritize these options. So if they're trying to find a career as they're attached to the military or after, um, we might come up with 4 or 5 options that they're thinking about. Then we got to prioritize those things based on their values, based on their interest, values, skills, all those kinds of things. We need to prioritize those things, and then we need to implement them. So if we're working with a military spouse who's trying to figure out what are what are the next steps for me? We've got to find out what that next step is, and then we got to do it. And then that's execution. And then finally, we come back to communication because we want to see how we did. Do we think that our process got us what we were looking for? Because again, this is a learning engagement. This is my hope is when I'm working with a military spouse that what we're doing is something they can apply again. That's one of the reasons why the theory has a limited number of components in both the pyramid and the cycle, because we want it to be something that they can recall as they move forward. Because there will be other career questions that come up. There will be other transitions that occur. So I want them to remember, well, I met with that Seth guy. We talked about knowledge of self, knowledge of options, how I make decisions, how I'm thinking about it. And then we also talked about, I need to kind of go through this process to find what I'm looking for. And so again, the previous one was a practitioner version. This is what I share with the client. I got to make a choice. I got to understand these elements of myself and how I'm experiencing this. I got to expand and narrow options. I got to prioritize it, and then I got to do it. Okay, so again, there's the pyramid and there's the Kasabi cycle. These are kind of the two primary components of CIP. But then we also have to adapt. So I think that's important to keep in mind. And so we want to look at readiness. So if we're working with somebody, we want to ensure that what we're providing them is truly what they need. But we have to kind of assess for that because I might give them something that they don't need. I've got a quick story about this. So and this is beyond military spouse. I was working with a college student at a university career center. And the student came in and had a big binder of information and was looking for a resume critique. And so came in, gave me the resume. Oh, okay, yeah, you might want to think about this, might want to think about that. I've done a lot of those. But my curiosity around the binder got the best of me. And I asked about it. I asked about, tell me about this binder. It just seemed like it's, got a lot of information. Could have been notes for a class, could have been whatever. And what it ended up being is a lot of information that the student had gathered around occupational options. And so while it came in for resume critique, we did that. The student was stuck. The student was stuck and had gotten a lot of information, but was not moving forward. And so what I could have done is I could have said, oh, you're thinking about doing this? Why don't you go research and gather some information on that? Well, the student already did that. So I need to know kind of where they are in their process, how capable are they, how are they feeling about it, how are they thinking about it, and then I need to adapt my information and our way of moving forward with that in mind to ensure I'm providing what's actually needed. That's a focus of CIP. Okay, and not everybody needs the same amount of support. Counseling is a scarce resource. Career support is a scarce resource. And so there are some people who just need the resume critique or just need a piece of information. So when I talk about complexity and capability, capability is your cognitive and affective ability to move forward and make a decision. How are you thinking about it? How are you feeling about it? If you have low capability, that means that you're diminished in those areas. There might be a lack of clarity in terms of your understanding of what to do. You might be highly anxious about it, so you might be low capability. If you have high capability, you're in a reasonable place in terms of how you're feeling about it, and you also seem to have the appropriate knowledge, the appropriate cognitive capacity to do this. But then there's also complexity. So complexity are all those external factors like family, economy, broader society, all those kinds of things. So there are times where certain people's situation could be highly complex, whether it be their family situation, their economic situation, and so on. But then there also might be low complexity. So nope, things seem to be good. People are very supportive of what I'm trying to do. Um, I have time because from an income level, we're doing pretty well. So there's not a lot of complexity. So what we do from a CIP lens is we try to figure out where these people are and do they need a lot of support or do they maybe need a little less support? And so we assess for that. So if they have low complexity and high capability, they're likely not going to need a lot of help. They might just need the resume critique, might just need a piece of information. But on the other end of that, if it's highly complex, a lot of things going on that make it complex, and they're really struggling in various ways, they're going to need more support. And then there's kind of in between, as you can see, for those of you who can, on the quadrants here. So I want to ensure, again, going back to counseling as a scarce resource, I want to ensure that I'm providing the appropriate level of support because if I give everybody a lot of resources and not everybody needs it, then there are some who are not being served. And so it's just something to keep in mind. I need to assess where are they with their complexity, capability, and then how much support is likely going to be needed here. Okay, so one more research study. This is it, I promise. So one of the things that's interesting, and you all may resonate with this, is we often don't have an opportunity to meet with people for a long period of time. When we're doing career support, or any kind of support, we might not get an opportunity to work with people over a long period of time, especially those who are attached to the military. Transitions are often or frequent and often unpredictable. So those I've worked with in the military, it's like, okay, we're kind of chugging along, and all of a sudden it's like, well, no, I'm leaving. And so what's interesting to me is to think about how beneficial is a brief engagement. And so we did some research on this because I do think that it speaks to the potential impact of our work, even if it is only for a brief period of time. So when we think about brief assisted model, that's kind of the in between of the don't need a lot of help, needs a lot of help. So that's what the brief assisted is, kind of in between those two. And so what we did is we looked at a 20 to 30-minute engagement with someone focused on career and the impact of that. And so this was at a university career center. These are people who just drop in, they just come in for help. They don't have to have an appointment. They met with someone for 20 to 30 minutes who is operating from a CIP lens. We gave some assessments in relation to that, and the more information to come on that in terms of the assessments, that there's more to come on that again. But we looked at what was the effect of this brief engagement. The study was conducted at Florida State University. Thank you, Jackie. That's important. I want to address that. And then, so what was the effect of that brief engagement? What kind of attitudes did the client think in terms of this? Did they think it was effective? And then what outcomes did it have? And so we did a pre and a post. So people came in, gave them assessments. They met with a career advisor for about 20, 30 minutes. And then we asked them again where they were. And so we looked at the difference between the pre and the post. And so these are some things we looked at. I don't want to get into too much detail. I promised you I wouldn't geek out on the research part. But we did pre and post surveys and used a session rating scale. So primarily, there's some other outcomes as well, but all I want to focus on is, again, going back to career and mental health. What kind of impact did this career-focused engagement for 20 to 30 minutes with someone looking from a CIP lens? And it seems that there were some positive outcomes beyond just the career focus. So there was an indication of an increase in knowledge of next steps. So they came in, they're trying to figure something out. And based on that 20 to 30-minute engagement, they seem to indicate that there's an increase in their knowledge of what to do next. Also, an increase in their confidence. So again, as you look at this chart here, for those who aren't on, there's like a positive, neutral, negative, and there's a fair amount who had a positive engagement, a fair amount who had neutral, and mostly that was neutral, but again, 20 to 30-minute engagement, and a minimal number of people who actually had a negative outcome. But we had people who indicated they seem to have an increase in confidence in next steps. And then also a decrease in anxiety. So again, career mental health. I'm coming in to talk to a career practitioner. I've got this career concern. But now that I've talked to this person, I feel that I'm less anxious now that I've done that. And so I just think it's really interesting that you all may encounter people for a brief period of time, may only meet with them once, but yet there still seems to be some positive, not only with the career concern, but also with their overall feeling and thoughts around what to do, some mental health components. So again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how, but that has implications for interventions. So speaking of interventions, I'd like to give you all some specific things to consider when you're working um, with military spouses around career and work. And so when we think about interventions, I've broken them down into various ways. And so executive processing is the top of the pyramid. And so what do we do if people are having things going on there? That's self-talk, that's self-awareness, monitoring control. What do we do about that? Well, what we can do is look at the career thoughts inventory. So that the career thoughts inventory, and I don't have any, I'm not a publisher of that. I did not create that assessment, but it is related to CIP. And again, I don't have any benefit from suggesting it. No monetary benefit. It's just a useful instrument that's related to CIP. And so the career thoughts inventory looks at those beliefs. So it's 48 items, and you get some different kinds of components that come from that. You have a negative career thoughts overall score. So it gives you a sense of the degree of negative career thinking someone is experiencing, but then there's also some subscales. And so the subscales are around decision-making confusion, commitment anxiety, and external conflict. So those are the three subscales of that. So when you get that information, that tells you a little bit about, okay, we've got some decision-making confusion here. So let's talk about your decision-making process. Or commitment anxiety. It's like, okay, to execute the choice, and we think about the Kasabi cycle, I'm highly anxious about that. So that's one resource, but there's also a workbook that goes along with it. And so with the workbook, you reframe those things. So you look at the beliefs on the assessment, and then you work with the client to see how useful this belief is, how is it negatively impacting you, and then let's change that belief to where it's not negatively impacting you or hindering your progress. We can also explore a little bit how they're feeling about what's going on. So we might ask them, how anxious are you about this, or how do you feel about this transition that you're making in terms of your career and work? So we can get curious about how they're feeling about it. And then we can look at individual action plans to help them manage the process. So what are your goals? What are the steps you can take related to that? And then what are you going to do? Uh, in addition, there's some other things you can explore. So RIASEC theory is John Holland's work. And so it's a way in looking at it's a kind of a personality dimension of looking at person in relation to environment in terms of work. And so there's more to learn about that theory, I encourage you to explore that. That's John Holland's work. Ryasek looks at interest of person matched with environment. And so you can look at those things paired together, often used together. You can, again, look at the emotional aspect of the concern. And then when we're looking at their pyramid, or we're looking at various things, like where do they need some support? And so it may be the top of the pyramid. So we need to look at that. Maybe their decision-making process isn't clear, or could use some support. Maybe they don't have a lot of awareness of their interest, value, skills in terms of knowledge of self. Maybe they don't have a lot of understanding of options and what that looks like. One of the things that I think is interesting to me is that there are times where I think people don't have a full awareness of what the variety of various occupations. They often will have a simplistic view, and I'll talk about that more here in a little bit. So that's something we can explore. There's another thing you can use about guide to good decision making exercise. So the guide to good decision making exercise kind of walks through the Kasabi cycle, incorporates elements of the pyramid. And so how do we go about making decisions? Again, we want to empower them to be able to develop those skills, effective career decision making and problem solving. Regardless of the unique nature of your concern, we want you to have skills to effectively navigate this. And that's one exercise that does that. And I already mentioned the workbook. So when we think about how do we assess readiness and things that happen there, again, looking at complexity and capability, we need to get curious about that. So ask them about their familial situation. Consider the broader economy. Like, one of the things that's interesting that's kind of happening now, I think, is this thought of computer science and the skills that people have with that, and the occupational um, availability of people who have that specific skill set, and how artificial intelligence is impacting that. So thinking about the broader economy, thinking about occupational options, like being aware of that, I think is important. And then other social pressures that may impact people's decision-making process. But we want to have these discussions, their own motivation, their personal responsibility, all those kinds of things. And so again, assessments, the last point, looking at career thoughts inventory, decision space worksheet. I'll talk about that momentarily to kind of look at what are some things that might be useful to inform our discussion. Okay, so I mentioned the individual learning plan, and I want to revisit it because I think it's a really useful way to structure the conversation. So if I have a military spouse who comes to me and they're looking for career support, I will use this. I will use this to develop like a clear idea of how we're going to navigate this. And so with the individual learning plan, we need to figure out, what are your goals? So if a military spouse is looking for career support, I want to know what goals they have for themselves related to career and work. So that's the top of the individual learning plan. And so a couple of examples: clarify interests, determine my readiness. I might be looking at additional schooling. I'm looking at um, potentially a graduate degree. I want to improve my peer networking. So these are different goals, and I would discuss this with the military spouse. What kind of goals do you have for yourself related to career and work? If you do individual learning plan, or if you look at Florida State University Career Center, that's where you can get that from. You should be able to find that, Candace. So individual learning plan, ILP, Florida State University Career Center. If you do some searching there, you should be able to locate it. But you might adapt this in your own way as well. But just for me, the overall focus of it is goals aligned with activities, because at times I sense that people don't have clarity around what it is they're trying to achieve. They're just kind of like doing things, and it's not directly related to their goals. So I think the point of the individual learning plan is to align goals with activities. So we want to articulate goals, but then we want to figure out how are we going to work towards those goals. And that's the next section with the activity. And each one has like, okay, what are we going to do? What's the purpose of that? How long do we think that's going to take? And then what goals is this aligned with? And then we want to prioritize it. So it really gets specific with what we're doing. And there's a reason for that, because if we're going to decide to do something to try and address the military spouse's concern, we got to have clarity about the reason why we're doing that. How much time do we think this is going to take? Which goals does this align with? But then also, when should this happen? I think it's really interesting to think about, I've got all these things I'm trying to do, but, what are we going to do first? What are we going to do second? And so on. So that's something that this form allows us to do. And so just a couple of quick examples of activities. When we think about complete the career thoughts inventory, which I've discussed, I want to look at these negative career thoughts. It'll take me about 15 minutes to do it. It's aligned with my first goal, which is to clarify interests and ascertain readiness, and I'm going to do that first. So that's an example of this is, and I talk with the military spouse about this. We create this plan together. Like we talk about, okay, so this is what we're going to plan to do. And this is something that I continually bring up in our time together if I work with them over time. Like I will bring this out, we talked about the individual learning plan. Like, let's bring this back. How are we doing with this? Do we want to do something different? So there are different ways in which I will continually revisit the individual learning plan, but it really lays out what's our process going forward. Okay. And then, um, sorry, I went way too far ahead, skipped ahead a little bit. Some other assessments that I think have a lot of value are card sorts. So you may or may not be familiar with card sorts. So I'll kind of give a brief explanation of these. There's a ton of these. You can buy them or you can make them on your own. And so what card sorts I think provide is an intervention. Okay, looks like Mikkel has some value in card sorts. Is it gives us a way in which to organize potential options. So I'll give a quick example of occupational card sorts. So occupational card sorts, you would have a lot of different occupational options. So engineer, lawyer, physician, nurse practitioner, mental health counselor, teacher, entrepreneur, all these different kinds of things. And so you might have on one side the label, but if there's like, I may not be fully aware of what that is, on the other side of the card, you might have a description of that option. And so those are the options cards. But then you also have some category cards. And so the category cards might be least likely, likely, most likely. And so how I would frame this with a military spouse is I would say, it seems like we're trying to figure out what are some good options for you. I have these cards here, and we're gonna kind of do this together. And so I have these different category cards. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at these cards. If you're not sure of what the occupation is, look at the back side of the card. But I want you to organize them in least likely to do it, likely to do it, or most likely to do it. So here you go. And so then as the person who is supporting them, I will observe them as they complete this task. As they're going through and they're like, yeah, I'd put this here, or oh yeah, I'd put this there. And so I will just observe their process, and then I might comment on things as I see that they're thinking through something. So they might be stuck on a card and they're really thinking about where to put it. I might ask them about that. It's like, tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking, because it seems like you're not sure where to put that. So when I have them complete card sorts, I think there's value to observing the process and doing and being there to see that. So when they're done, they have all these different occupational options organized in these different categories, and then we talk about it. So tell me more about what you have here. Looks like you've got these 5 options and most likely. Tell me about that. Like what made you put them there? And so and that's just an example of a question. I would ask lots of questions. I just encourage you to lean into your own curiosity around what you see. And one of the things that can happen is that you can have a lot of people, a lot of options, a lot of cards that are put in the least likely. So that's something to observe and to note, and then to think about how do we work with that. You might also have a lot of cards in the most likely. And so that's also something that you would want to explore with them, because we need to find like a functional number of options to explore and then also to prioritize as we go back to the Kasabi cycle. Got to prioritize those options. So card sorts are really interesting. Again, you can find a lot out there. You can make your own. You could also do it around values and also leisure activities. And these are just a couple of examples. But I would encourage you just to become familiar with them and to think about how can I use it to help enhance knowledge of self, knowledge of options. How do they go about making decisions? What is their thinking and thoughts around it? How is this helpful for them with the cycle? So tying the card sorts to the theory, but then also thinking about how is this going to be useful for them. Another thing that I think is really interesting to consider is the decision space worksheet. So that goes to the valuing component of the Kasabi cycle. So with the decision space worksheet, we're really looking at thoughts, feelings, circumstances, people, or events that are impacting the decision they're making. And so we want to articulate what's the career decision for the military spouse. And again, what are these things that are related to it? Thoughts, feelings, circumstances. And then that's the top part of what I have here is the front of the resource. The decision space is actually a full circle, just for the sake of showing you it. It's a half circle, but it's actually a full circle. And what the military spouse is instructed to do is within the circle, draw smaller circles that represent the magnitude or relative importance of each thing that they list. So one quick example of how this might manifest is they might on the front list family as a kind of a big factor in impacting their decision. And then it also might be money. So whatever their career decision is, if financial elements is a big part of it. And so they list that on the front of the page, but then on the back of the page within the decision space, they depict the magnitude of that. So if money is more important, that circle is bigger. If family is important but not as important, that circle is smaller. And you might have some overlap. I mean, they have a lot of there's no right way to do this. And so what the military spouse puts here is something for us to explore. And I think it helps us with the valuing element of what it is important to you, what's impacting your decision. And then it gives us a graphical depiction of that, which then we can use to determine how we're going to move forward. How are we going to support the military spouse? And it's just a different way in which to kind of get a sense of their thoughts, feelings, circumstances, people or events that are impacting things, and then again, the degree of importance. Okay, so these are some specific things you can do in addition to what's already been shared. And I think these could be really useful for military spouses. Okay, so we have a case study, and I want to have some time to explore the case study. So I'm going to read it. There's some questions that follow it, and we're going to provide this to where you can, it's going to be in the chat, both the case study and the questions. The case study's in the chat. Thank you, Kayla. But I'm also going to read it so that you can hear it. And then use the chat. I would like to hear some of your responses, but I realize this is a lot of information. I'd like for you to think about what we've discussed thus far. Like, how does CIP, cognition processing career theory, inform our response to this? What are some of the interventions I might use? Now, you don't just have to do that. Obviously, there might be some other things that are relevant, but I do want you to think about the case study in relation to the lens in which we've been looking. Okay, so Stephanie, a military spouse, has a significant other who is serving in the US Army. As part of their experience, they are frequently moved. She has struggled with securing meaningful employment while supporting her spouse's military career and serving as the primary caregiver for their children. She has worked in several jobs in technological support, as this aligns with her undergraduate degree in computer science. She indicated she is really frustrated due to her struggles to maintain consistent employment and advance in her career due to familial demands and frequent moves. She is interested in exploring career possibilities, but is uncertain if she wants to remain in her current field or consider alternative paths. So that is Stephanie. And it's also in the chat. And again, thinking about CIP, here are some questions I would like for you all to think about. And take a moment to do that. Would like to see your answers in the chat pod, but I understand it may take a minute to formulate your response. So the first question is, what are the relevant career and mental health factors impacting Stephanie's experience? And the second question is, what are the relative elements of CIP that apply to this case? Okay, so take your time. Would like to see some of your responses. And I will draw attention to some of them. I will certainly comment on them, but may not get to all of them. But again, take a look at the case, think about what we've talked about, and respond to these questions. Yeah, sorry, I was giving people a moment to respond to the case study, so I figured it'd be better if I was not talking during that. So sorry, Janine. Okay, so whenever you're all ready, feel free to put your response in the chat. Okay, so Mikhail, if I'm saying that correctly, apologize if that's not correct, indicated relevant factors or a desire for meaningful and impactful employment. So that was something that was indicated. Robin discussed frequent moves, securing employment, and being the primary caregiver are some big things. One thing that was brought up, telework. So Abraham talked about the career field as IT, so telework, it's more stable with relocation. Might want to take an assessment also, the REASEC, to consider changes to another career field. So going back to that interest and maybe looking at options related to that. Okay. Um, it sounds like this, Kayla's indicated that someone on YouTube seems to feel that this case is reflective of many that they work with. So frustration, frequent moves, meaningful employment, Jackie's indicated. And then, yeah, so it seemed like there's starting to be some consistent indication around that there's that it's not just like I need to know something more. There's also feelings around it. There's also what are the options that are out there. Um, and then do I want to stay with what I'm doing? And what does meaningful mean? Someone had meaningful in capital letters. Like, what does that mean for Stephanie? What are we talking about when we mean meaningful employment? And one of the things that the frustration piece, I mean, I think this was talked about earlier in the chat, but it's interesting to think about a military spouse's ability to advance in their career with the frequent moves. And so there are times where that can be difficult. So I'll give you one quick example. As a mental health counselor, one of the things that we have to do is that we have to go to a state and we have to accrue supervised hours after we graduate from our program to become licensed as a counselor. And so there's one military spouse that I know that she's a PhD level counselor and has been unable to secure her license because it's been difficult to find a supervisor. It's been difficult to find a place where she can get those hours because there's been a lot of moving. And so that's just one example of others where it's difficult to kind of establish oneself in a career uh, when you have that going on. Now it's just something to explore. People may have different feelings around it. Like this is what we're doing, and they may be fine with it, but there might be some degree of frustration that might be useful to look at. Um, there's thoughts, feelings, behaviors. There's looking at the pyramid. How does Stephanie's experience relate to the pyramid? How does Stephanie's experience relate to the Kasabi cycle? How much support is Stephanie going to need in terms of her readiness? And then what are the things that we can do? And so that leads us to question 2. And so I'll come back to the case study. What are the relevance elements of CIP that apply to this case? So it looks like you all gave a fair amount of attention to the first question. I would like you all now to think about CIP and then what it is we've discussed thus far that would have application here. So what are the relevant elements of CIP that apply to this case? So feel free to respond in the chat to that question in relation to Stephanie. Okay, so Jackie indicated determining readiness. Um, Marina indicated that one of the things that um, it could be useful is to support people um, in what kind of employment aligns with their experience, knowledge, and education, and then also do they need to get some additional certifications or licenses to be competitive? What's their degree of support is also indicated, problem solving and decision making. That is, I think, a critical element of here. How do we support Stephanie with her situation? So, in my thought on this, is that when I'm working with Stephanie, I want to get a sense of knowledge of self, knowledge of options. How does she make this decision? So, how is she navigating this? And then I might sit with the frustration a little bit. I might explore. Tell me what about this is frustrating. What is it like to be frustrated? And I think even though I am a licensed counselor, when there are elements of feelings and thoughts that are directly related to their career concern, I still think it's important to explore that because they're directly related. And so that's something that I would think about. And so just keep this in mind around CIP, the different components here, how we're going to navigate the situation with Stephanie. So Tiffany indicated that there seems to be knowledge of self, knows our options. It seems like the top of the pyramid is most important. So that's really interesting. And so if that's the case, then I'm going to want to spend time at the top of the pyramid. So I might give a career thoughts inventory and really look at the responses. And we might do the career thoughts workbook in relation to it. So because what research tells us is that if we ignore the top of the pyramid, it's going to continually weigh down our progress. So there is a benefit of looking at those metacognitions, that thinking about decision making. It's important to pay attention to that. And in this case with Stephanie, that would be the frustration, those kinds of things. It's important to pay attention to that. And so, okay, so we're going to, um, there's a couple of things to think about moving forward. We're not going to do this here because we're coming to a close. But how would you utilize assessments to inform your work? So this is something for you to take with you and think about. I've talked about some, there might be some others. So how do you do that? And then what integrated interventions would you utilize? So integrated meaning career and mental health. Now I get it. Like not all of you may be licensed counselors. That being said, and there was a question about this earlier about who is capable of doing it. I do think these things are relevant, and it's important to pay attention to these things. You don't necessarily have to be a licensed counselor to use CIP. You just don't. If you're providing career support, you can learn this approach and you can utilize it. Okay, so a couple quick thoughts. The career and mental health are related. So the degree that you can pay attention to that in your own work is something for you to consider. I do think military spouses have a unique experience. We've talked about that a little bit. I do think they have some unique characteristics. CIP is designed to help military spouses and others, of course, but I think it has direct relevance with military spouses, especially that empowerment piece, and then decision making and problem solving skills piece. How do we integrate these elements of theory, practice, and research? I've talked about all three today. So what does that look like for you? How do I use theory? How does it inform practice? And how do I use research to know more about what's going on? And I've described a couple of studies, but I would encourage you to think about that. And I do think that when we're providing services to military spouses, we need to think about, is the way in which we're doing it reflective of their experience? And so if you are not a mental health provider It doesn't mean that you can't talk about aspects of their experience beyond just the career concern. How are they thinking about it? How are they feeling about it? But you might collaborate with a mental health provider if whatever concern emerges is very significant. But that's a collaborative experience. Okay. All right. So now we have some questions, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hayden. Just being mindful of everyone's time, and due to time constraints, we were unable to address all the questions during today's webinar. We encourage you to either drop your questions here in the chat really quickly, or you can email your questions to oneopspouseemployment@gmail.com, and responses will be provided in a Q&A document available on the OneOp webinar event page. But again, thank you, Dr. Hayden, for such an incredible presentation today. It was packed with valuable insights and resources. And a big thank you to all in the audience for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. If you'd like to reach out to Dr. Hayden directly or follow his work, here on the next slide, you can find his contact information displayed on the screen. I'll be sharing the continuing education details shortly, but first, I want to highlight an on-demand webinar. In November, we hosted a webinar that focused on how employment can act as a protective factor for military families impacted by domestic abuse. The session sparked a thoughtful discussion about how we can strengthen support systems for these families and respond effectively during critical moments when timely and informed action matters most. You'll find the event page URL on this slide, and it is also linked in the chat pod. As always, we encourage you to check out our comprehensive collection of on-demand OneOp webinars and take advantage of those free CE opportunities. And please mark your calendar as we invite you to attend our next webinar coming up on Thursday, February 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It's entitled Supporting Military Couples Through Employment and Financial Transitions. Our upcoming webinar will explore how PCS moves and other military transitions can disrupt spouse employment, often creating financial strain and added stress that impact overall family well-being. This interactive session will equip service providers with practical strategies and coordinated referral pathways to help couples connect with resources that strengthen family stability and support force readiness. You can register now on the OneOp webinar event page, as well as through the link shared in the chat pod. We value your feedback on your experience participating in today's webinar. It is very important to us, so we ask our audience to take a short evaluation, letting us know your thoughts on today's discussion. We would greatly appreciate your response. Your feedback will help us to continue to improve your professional development experience. The link to this evaluation, as well as continuing education opportunities, is available on the event page. When you visit the page, you will see the purple button similar to the one you see pictured here on the slide. Click that and it will take you to the evaluation as well as the post-test link to receive your CE credits. If you do not see this button, perhaps due to having the page open for an extended period, please refresh or exit out and reload the page. To access continuing education opportunities or certificate of attendance, you can follow the direct link to the evaluation which has just been shared to the chat pod. If you prefer to access this later, please navigate to the webinar event page for today's session and follow the purple continuing education button. Today's webinar offers 1.5 continuing education credits, along with a certificate of attendance for general use. For those wanting to receive continuing education credit, here are the available opportunities found on the screen. Select CE types require the completion of a post-test. With a completion of 80% or higher, a certificate will automatically be emailed to you within 24 to 48 hours to the email address you provide. Please note that some email providers will direct certificates to your spam folder, so be sure to check there as well. For questions regarding continuing education, please email ce@oneop.org. And let's stay connected. We invite you to subscribe to our mailing list by scanning the QR code on the screen. We have also dropped the link to the mailing list in the chat pod. Please be sure to sign up and follow along for all of OneOp's programming. And lastly, be sure to visit us at our website, oneop.org, to explore upcoming events articles, resources, and more. You can also find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. As a reminder, a YouTube recording of today's webinar will be available for viewing on the event page within 48 hours. We thank you all again for attending and hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.